Now let's take a look at using the symmetry settings. So jumping back into Blender, let's come back down to our symmetry section. And any model that we work on, a lot of times you're going to have to, or it's going to be advantageous for you to be able to sculpt symmetrically. So if you're working on some sort of a character, a lot of times those are going to be symmetrical. So same detail on one side as on the other. Even if, in the end, you're going to make them a little bit more asymmetrical, the basic shapes are going to be pretty symmetrical. We've got two eyes and you've got two ears and you've got detail that's going to be mirrored across in many cases. So if that comes up, you can use the symmetry settings to make that a little bit easier. So opening this up, you can see we have a mirror section right here. This corresponds to our three axes, so X, Y, and Z. So assuming that we want to create detail on this side, on the left-hand side of our screen, and on the right side, that's going to be along the X direction. So we'll turn on X mirroring and just click to activate that. And so now we can sculpt, and you can see that the detail has been mirrored over to the other side. Now there's not one good side and one side that's being mirrored. It really works both ways. So I could come over here and sculpt, and it's the same as if I sculpt on this side. So the detail's mirrored to the other side no matter which side of the particular axis that you're using. Okay, now we can also come in and sculpt using symmetry on multiple axes. So for instance, if I wanted to do just Y, that would be top and bottom of the screen because that's the Y axis here. But I could also do X and Y. So it could create some interesting effects here because now we're mirroring not only from top to bottom, but also left and right. So you can create some detail that way. Now in this case, using the Z axis doesn't really make as much sense because we don't have a sort of a cube shape that we're working with, so there's really no thickness to it. But if it was a complete model, you could use the Z-axis as well. Okay. Now, if we turn on the X-axis here and we begin to come over and start sculpting detail, and for instance, this is the center here, we might want the detail to kind of feather over the axis, and so we can use the feathering. And you can see that looks a little bit more natural than the bulges that we're getting when our strokes are overlapping without that on. So if you're going to be sculpting across the axis, you can turn that feathering on. Now we can also turn on radial symmetry. So in this case, think about our axes, right? So we've got our X, Y, and Z, and think about the radial strokes as going around a particular axis. So in this case, we've got this laying flat on the X and Y plane. So we want our strokes to be kind of mirrored around the Z-axis in this case. So I'm going to take the Z number and let's just increase this to something a little bit higher. So now when we come in and start to create our detail, you can see that it's actually mirrored around. And let me turn off our X-axis. There we go. It's actually creating a sort of a grid or a radial array around this Z-axis, which is pointing up and down. And so if I come in here, I can start to create some really cool detail using this radial symmetry. And the axis that you choose is really going to depend on the model. We can increase this amount, and then maybe we can push it in, and we can start to create some really interesting radial patterns. And so that's using the radial amounts here in our symmetry. So we're working with a simple plane, but if you're working with some more complex geometry, we're going to have kind of a base shape that we're working with a little bit later on to do kind of a simple character. We would want to really use this symmetry to help us be efficient. So we're not having to sculpt the same detail on one side as we sculpt on the other side. We can get at least to a good base point where we've got detail that's the same on both sides, and then from that point we could turn off symmetry and then add our asymmetry to really make it look realistic. But those symmetry settings can be found right here under symmetry. We can also there's a little section down here for locking. We can lock the movement of the vertices in a particular axis as well. If we want them to only move in maybe two different axes but not in the other one, we can use those. All right, so that's a look at using symmetry. You can turn that off or on based on any of the in conjunction with any of the brushes that you're using. And so in the next lesson, let's take a look at how we can set up a multi-resolution sculpt. So multi-resolution is going to be the typical thing that you probably think of when you think of sculpting, the fact that you can go up and down these different subdivision levels and make changes to the geometry at those different levels, and it all works well together. And so we're going to take a look at how we can set that up inside of Blender in the next lesson.